It started with the small things. You know, the ones that don't scream at you, but tap persistently on the edge of your consciousness. A misplaced cologne bottle. A phone call that ended the moment I walked into the room. The way Mark's hand lingered too long on my mother's shoulder during our Sunday dinner last month. I didn't want to believe it. After all, this was my husband of 7 years, the father of our son Ethan. And Linda, my mother, was the woman who raised me through every scraped knee and heartbreak. If there were two people I thought I could count on, it was them. But over the past month, Mark's late-night work meetings had become more frequent. His texts became more guarded, his phone always face down on the kitchen counter. I wanted to tell myself it was just stress from his job at the tech firm, or maybe a midlife crisis brewing 2 decades too early. But then there was the laughter. I heard it one afternoon while folding laundry. Mark was on a phone call in the living room, and I could hear him laughing. Not the kind of polite chuckle he gave to clients, or the sarcastic snort he reserved for office gossip. This was different, warmer, softer. Familiar. "Emily, can you pass the salt?" Linda asked, her voice smooth and pleasant as always. I pushed the shaker toward her without looking up. I didn't trust myself to meet her eyes tonight. It wasn't the first time she joined us for dinner. Ever since Dad passed, she'd been over at least once a week. But tonight something felt off. Mark was unusually animated, cracking jokes and refilling Linda's wine glass before she could ask. Every so often, I caught her glancing at him, her lips curling into a smile that was just a little too wide. "Ethan, eat your peas," I said absently, though my focus was elsewhere. "Yuck," he protested, shoving the plate away. "Ethan, listen to your mom," Mark said, his voice firm but affectionate. The dynamic at the table felt forced, like a poorly rehearsed play where everyone knew their lines but couldn't sell the act. I stared at my plate, pushing around the mashed potatoes while my thoughts spiraled. "Emily, are you okay?" Linda's voice cut through my haze. I looked up, startled.
"What?"
"Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." Mark's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second before darting back to his plate. The guilt was written all over his face, but I couldn't put my finger on why. The phone message. Later that night, after Ethan was asleep and Mark had gone to shower, I found myself standing in our bedroom, staring at his phone on the nightstand. It wasn't like me to snoop. But then again, I wasn't the type to doubt my husband, either. A voice in the back of my head whispered, "You're overreacting." But my hand moved on its own, grabbing the phone and unlocking it with the code I knew by heart. Most of the messages were mundane, group chats with coworkers, a few exchanges with his buddies about an upcoming poker night. But then I saw it. A thread labeled L. My heart thudded in my chest as I opened it.
"Can't stop thinking about last night."
"Same here. When can I see you again?" I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. My mother's name was Linda. Could it be someone else? Another L? But the timestamp told me otherwise. It was sent right after our Sunday dinner. I didn't hear Mark step out of the bathroom until he spoke. "Hey, what are you doing?" I whipped around, shoving the phone back onto the nightstand like a guilty teenager caught with a stolen cigarette. "Nothing," I said, too quickly. He narrowed his eyes but didn't push it. Instead, he climbed into bed, his hair damp and smelling of the sandalwood shampoo I bought him last Christmas. "Long day," he murmured, pulling the covers up. I lay beside him, my body stiff, my mind racing. The message burned in my brain like a neon sign, refusing to dim. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how deep this rabbit hole went, and if I had the courage to find out. I couldn't let it go. The message lingered in my mind like a bad song stuck on repeat, each word chipping away at my trust.
"Can't stop thinking about last night."
My mother's name. Mark's unusual nervousness. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. By morning, I was resolved. I needed answers, not just for myself, but for Ethan. I wasn't going to blow up my marriage or confront Linda without proof. Mark left for work early as usual, kissing me on the cheek before grabbing his coffee. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face. "Fine," I lied, forcing a smile. The moment the door clicked shut, I grabbed his laptop. Mark was meticulous about locking his devices, but he wasn't as careful with his work computer. I knew he used the same password for everything. Ethan 2016. It opened. My stomach churned as I navigated his email. At first, it was all standard stuff: work schedules, project updates, the occasional reminder from HR about upcoming deadlines. But then I found it. A series of messages buried in his archived folder, flagged with a small gold star. I opened the first email, my hands trembling. Mark, thanks for the ride home the other night. I don't know what I'd do without you. The second one was even worse. You have no idea how hard it is to keep this a secret. Sometimes I feel like we're playing with fire. I sat back, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind reeled, flashing back to every interaction between Mark and Linda. There's that time last summer when our AC broke, and Mark insisted on fixing it himself instead of calling a repairman. He'd spend hours at Linda's house, sweating in the July heat while she brought him lemonade and complimented his handiness. I hadn't thought anything of it then. And the trip to the mall last Christmas, when Linda had called Mark to help her carry bags because I was too busy, she'd laughed about it afterward, saying, "What would I do without your husband?" Each memory now felt tainted, reframed by what I'd just read. I decided to follow Mark after work. It wasn't my proudest moment, but desperation has a way of overriding shame. I parked across the street from his office, pretending to scroll through my phone as I waited for him to leave. At 6:15 p.m., he walked out, his tie loosened, and his phone pressed to his ear. I started the car and tailed him, keeping a safe distance. He didn't head home. Instead, he drove to a quiet part of town where the houses were older, more spread out. My chest tightened as I recognized the neighborhood. Linda's house. He parked in her driveway, glancing around as if checking for witnesses, before heading inside. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with possibilities, each more damning than the last. The truth begins to unravel. I couldn't sit there forever. After 20 minutes, I got out of the car, walking toward the house as quietly as I could. The curtains were drawn, but a crack in the living room window allowed me to hear their voices. "I hate sneaking around like this," Mark was saying. "I know, but what choice do we have?" Linda's voice replied, soft and full of something I couldn't quite place. "I don't want to hurt her," Mark said. "Hurt me?"
They were talking about me.
I backed away, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. My mind screamed at me to barge in, to confront them right then and there, but my body refused to move. Instead, I stumbled back to my car and drove away, tears blurring my vision. Gathering strength, back at home, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my hands. They were shaking, my wedding ring catching the light and mocking me. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. This was my mother, the woman who had been my rock through every storm. How could she do this to me? My phone buzzed on the table, and I saw a text from Linda. "Linda, hey sweetie, let me know if you and Ethan want to come over for dinner tomorrow. I miss you." I stared at the message, ball rising in my throat. Her audacity was staggering. Did she think I wouldn't find out? Or worse, did she think I'd forgive her if I did? I couldn't answer her. Not yet. Instead, I started making a plan. I spent the next day oscillating between numbness and rage. Every time I looked at Ethan's little face, it was like a punch to the gut. He deserved better than parents who lived a lie. I wasn't naive enough to think Mark or Linda would confess if I confronted them directly. They'd dodge and weave, and I'd end up with nothing but their hollow reassurances. No, I needed undeniable proof, something they couldn't talk their way out of. That evening, I made my move. Mark was in the shower when I picked up his phone again. This time, I didn't bother sneaking. If he caught me, so be it, I had nothing to lose. The thread with Linda was still there, though the messages had become more careful. Tomorrow night? Can't wait. I bit the inside of my cheek, forcing myself to stay calm. They had plans.
Good.
I would too. The next evening, I told Mark I had a last-minute PDA meeting. He barely looked up from his laptop, muttering something about ordering pizza for Ethan. His lack of curiosity stung, but it worked in my favor. I dropped Ethan off at my friend Sarah's house. Thankfully, she didn't ask too many questions, and drove toward Linda's place. Parking a few blocks away, I approached on foot, my heart pounding so loudly, I thought it might give me away. The house was dark except for a soft glow in the living room. I crept toward the side window, peering through the thin gap in the curtains. There they were. Mark was sitting on the couch, his tie loosened, while Linda perched next to him, her hand resting on his knee. They weren't touching any more intimately than that, but the way they leaned toward each other, the soft murmur of their voices, it was worse than if I'd caught them tangled in bed. They looked comfortable, like this wasn't the first time. I didn't plan what happened next. One moment, I was standing in the shadows, and the next, I was pounding on the front door. They both jumped, their faces snapping toward the sound. I saw Mark mouth a curse before Linda rushed to the door. "Emily," she said, opening it just wide enough to block my view of the room. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "That's funny. I was about to ask you the same thing." Mark appeared behind her, his face pale. "Emily, this isn't what it looks like, isn't it?" I shoved past Linda, stepping into the house. The smell of her lavender candles was nauseating, because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is. "Emily, calm down," Linda said, her voice soothing in a way that only enraged me further. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," I snapped, rounding on her. "How long has this been going on?"
Huh?
"How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" "Emily," Mark started, but I cut him off. "Shut up, Mark. I'm talking to her." Linda's composure cracked for the first time, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I didn't mean for this to happen," she stammered. "That's the best you've got?" I laughed again, the sound raw and jagged. "You didn't mean for this to happen? What, did you trip and fall onto him?" Mark stepped forward, his hands up like he was approaching a wild animal. "Emily, please. Let me explain." "Oh, this should be good," I said, crossing my arms. "Go ahead. Explain how you ended up in my mother's living room, whispering sweet nothings like a goddamn soap opera." "It wasn't planned," he said, his voice cracking. It just happened. It just happened," I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you, a teenager? You're a grown man, Mark. You don't accidentally have an affair with your wife's mother." Linda started crying, soft, hiccuping sobs that made me want to scream. "How dare she play the victim in this?" "You both make me sick," I said, my voice shaking. "Do you even realize what you've done? To me? To Ethan's?" "Emily, it's not like that," Mark said, desperation creeping into his tone. "Then what is it like, Mark? Enlighten me." He opened his mouth but couldn't seem to find the words. Linda looked away, tears streaming down her face. I stared at them, my chest heaving, waiting for some kind of explanation that would make this hurt less. But there wasn't one. There never would be. "You're pathetic," I said finally, my voice cold. "Both of you. I hope it was worth it, because you've lost me. And Ethan." Linda gasped, but I didn't wait for her to respond. I turned on my heel and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't make it to my car before the tears came, hot and fast, blurring my vision. I sank onto the curb, my shoulders shaking as the weight of their betrayal crashed over me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was just the beginning. When I woke up the next morning, it was as if the entire world had shifted overnight. My house, once a sanctuary, felt alien. The kitchen was too quiet, the walls too close. Mark had slept in the guest room, if he'd even come home at all, but I didn't bother checking. He was as much a stranger to me now as someone I might pass on the street. Ethan's laughter echoed from the living room, where cartoons flickered on the TV. The sound reminded me that life couldn't just stop, no matter how much I wanted it to. Sarah was the first person I called. I barely got through the initial explanation before her voice hardened. "Are you serious?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Mark and your mom?" "Emily, that's disgusting." "I don't even know how to process it," I admitted, my voice cracking. "You don't need to process it right now. You need to focus on what comes next," she said. "Do you want me to come over?" I hesitated. As much as I appreciated Sarah's offer, I wasn't ready for anyone else to step into this mess.
No.
Not yet. But thanks. She sighed, her concern palpable even through the phone. Okay, but if you change your mind, call me. Day or night. Mark finally emerged from the guest room around noon, his hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking more like a hungover frat boy than a man who had detonated his family the night before. Emily, we need to talk, he said. I didn't even look up from the coffee I was pouring.
About what?
How you've been screwing my mother behind my back. Or how you're going to explain this to Ethan when he's old enough to understand what a colossal piece of crap his father is. Mark flinched. I deserve that.
But
Nothing, I snapped, slamming the coffee pot onto the counter. You don't get to, but you're way out of this. Do you even understand what you've done? To me? To this family? I do, he said, his voice low. And I'm sorry. I laughed bitterly. Sorry?
wow, Mark.
That makes everything better. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked genuinely defeated. But it wasn't enough, not even close. Where's Ethan? He asked quietly. With Sarah, I said. Because I don't want him here while we figure out how to deal with this disaster. Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. I'll pack a bag and stay somewhere else for a while. That's the first good idea you've had in weeks, I said coldly. I wasn't done. As much as I wanted to cut my mother out of my life entirely, I couldn't do it without confronting her. She owed me answers, even if they wouldn't bring me peace. I drove to her house that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I knocked on her door, it took her a full minute to open it. Emily, she said softly, her eyes red and puffy. I pushed past her without a word, stepping into the living room where the betrayal had unfolded. It smelled like lavender candles again, and the sight of them made me want to vomit. We're doing this here, I said, crossing my arms. Sit down. Linda obeyed, sinking into the couch like a scolded child. I didn't sit. I couldn't. How long? I demanded. Emily, please.
How long?
Her lip trembled, and she looked down at her hands. 6 months. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. 6 months? You've been sneaking around with my husband for 6 months. It wasn't like that, she said quickly. It didn't start out. Don't you dare try to justify this, I snapped, cutting her off. You're my mother. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you've done? Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't feel even a shred of sympathy.
I know I've hurt you, she said.
I know I've ruined everything. But Emily, You what? I shouted. You love him? Is that what you're going to say? That you fell in love with your daughter's husband? She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. I laughed, the sound bitter and raw. You're unbelievable. You've destroyed our family, and for what? A man who couldn't even stay faithful to his wife. Linda sobbed harder, but I was done. I turned on my heel and walked out, slamming the door behind me. Small towns have a way of amplifying scandal, and this was no exception. Within days, whispers about Mark and Linda's affair had spread like wildfire. I hadn't told anyone besides Sarah, but somehow, everyone seemed to know. I couldn't walk into the grocery store without catching someone's pitying glance or overhearing a hushed conversation that stopped abruptly when I passed. Even Ethan's preschool teacher gave me a sympathetic look when I dropped him off. Mark had moved into a motel on the edge of town, and Linda had all but barricaded herself in her house. The two of them had become pariahs, and I couldn't bring myself to feel bad for either of them. But pity wasn't enough. They needed to face the full consequences of what they'd done. Late one night, after Ethan was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and my laptop. If they thought they could destroy my life and get away with it, they were sorely mistaken. The first thing I did was cancel the joint credit cards. Mark didn't deserve a dime of my hard-earned money. Then I started drafting an email to the HR department at Mark's firm. It was amazing how incriminating a few forwarded messages from his email thread with Linda could be. As for Linda, I had something special planned for her. Some betrayals demand vengeance. I wasn't proud of the person I'd become over the last few weeks, but pride wasn't on the menu. Mark and Linda had torn my life apart, and I was going to make sure they felt every splinter of it. The email to Mark's HR department was cold and calculated. I attached screenshots of his messages with Linda, emphasizing how their relationship could be construed as a personal distraction affecting his performance. I didn't embellish, I didn't need to. 2 days later, Mark called me from the motel. "What the hell did you do?" he barked, his voice taut with anger. "What I had to," I replied calmly. "What's the matter? Having trouble explaining to your boss why you're sexting your wife's mother on company time? You cost me my job, Emily," he shouted. "You cost me my family, Mark," I said, my tone ice cold. "We're not even." For the first time, he didn't have a response. Linda's punishment required a bit more finesse. It started with a Facebook post. I never named names, just a carefully worded message about betrayal and the damage it can do. But in a town like ours, it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. The comments flooded in. Some were supportive, others horrified. But the best part? The whispers at her church. Linda had always been the picture of propriety, a beacon of kindness and generosity. Now, she was a pariah. Sarah called me the morning after Linda's book club meeting. "She showed up late and left early," Sarah reported, her voice gleeful. "You should have seen the looks on everyone's faces." One woman actually moved her chair when Linda sat down. I didn't laugh, but a small, grim smile crept onto my face. Ethan was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but I did my best to shield him from the fallout. I didn't badmouth Mark or Linda in front of him, no matter how tempting it was. But the rest of the town? They were relentless. At the grocery store, I overheard an older woman muttering to her companion, "That poor Emily. Can you imagine? Her mother's?" Mark was spotted at a dive bar on the edge of town, drinking alone. Linda stopped showing up to her usual community events, retreating further into isolation. Good, I thought. Let them feel the weight of their actions. For weeks, I focused on rebuilding. I saw a lawyer about the divorce, started therapy, and leaned on Sarah more than ever. Slowly, I started to feel like myself again, or maybe someone new. Someone stronger. One evening, I went through the family photo albums. Ethan had asked about them, wanting to see pictures from when Mommy and Daddy were happy. The sight of Linda's face next to mine in so many pictures made my stomach churn. But instead of ripping the photos apart, I tucked them into a box and shoved it into the back of the closet. Out of sight, out of mind. I saved the best for last. Linda's birthday was approaching, and I knew she'd be expecting a card from me. Instead, I sent her a letter. It wasn't angry or cruel, just brutally honest. "Dear Mom," it began. "You've always taught me to take responsibility for my actions, so I hope you'll take responsibility for yours. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed Ethan, and you betrayed yourself. I hope one day you realize what you've lost. Until then, please don't contact me." I mailed it without a second thought. A week after the letter, Mark showed up at the house unannounced. He looked thinner, more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can we talk?" I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What do you want, Mark?" "I screwed up," he said, his eyes glistening. "I know that. And I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am." I crossed my arms, staring at him. "You're right. You don't deserve forgiveness. But I'll tell you what I told Linda. You'll have to live with the consequences of what you've done. That's your burden, not mine." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I didn't stay to watch him cry. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The pain wasn't gone, it might never fully leave. But I was still standing. And that was enough. Life doesn't stop when your world falls apart. Bills still need to be paid, groceries still need to be bought, and kids still need bedtime stories. As much as I wanted to curl up and wallow, I couldn't. Ethan deserved better than that. In the weeks following Mark's departure and my final confrontation with Linda, I found a strange sense of clarity. I realized that this wasn't just the end of something, it was the beginning of something new. Mark's absence from the house was like a weight lifting. The silence, which had once felt oppressive, now felt freeing. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, took down the wedding photos, and replaced them with pictures of Ethan and me. Sarah came over one Saturday to help me paint the kitchen. We chose a sunny yellow, a color I'd always loved but Mark had vetoed because he thought it was too bright. "It looks amazing," Sarah said, stepping back to admire our work. "It does," I agreed, feeling a small flicker of pride. The yellow walls were a little thing, but they felt like a declaration. This house was mine now. Linda hadn't tried to contact me since receiving my letter. Through the grapevine, I heard that she was still keeping to herself, avoiding the usual church groups and community events. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. She was my mother after all. But every time I thought about reaching out, I remembered her betrayal and the months of lies. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer. Not yet, and maybe not ever. Ethan asked about her once, his little brow furrowed in confusion. "Why doesn't Grandma come over anymore?" I knelt down, brushing a hand through his hair. "Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices, sweetheart. And when that happens, we have to take a break from them for a while." He seemed satisfied with that answer, at least for now. Mark was struggling, and everyone knew it. He'd taken a job at a hardware store to make ends meet, a far cry from his cushy tech firm position. Whenever I saw him in town, he looked hollowed out, like a shadow of the man he used to be. He tried to keep up appearances with Ethan, showing up for his scheduled weekends with a forced smile and too many toys. But even Ethan, in his childlike way, seemed to sense something was off. "Why is Daddy so sad?" he asked one day. I didn't know how to answer that. "Because he's learning some hard lessons," I said finally. One evening, as I was scrolling through my email, I saw a message from Sarah with the subject line, "Something for you." It was a link to a women's writing workshop being hosted in the next town over. "You need this," her message read. "It's time to focus on you." At first, I dismissed it. I wasn't a writer. But the idea nagged at me, and a week later, I signed up. The first session was nerve-wracking, but as I listened to the other women share their stories, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in months, I wasn't just Emily, the betrayed wife. I was Emily, a person with a story worth telling. A few months later, I found myself standing outside Linda's house again. I hadn't planned on going there. It was more of an impulse, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. When she opened the door, she looked older, more tired than I remembered. "Emily," she said, her voice hesitant. "What are you doing here?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I just wanted to see if you're okay." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the mother I used to know, the woman who'd been my confidant, my protector. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," I said. "But sorry doesn't fix this." "I don't expect it to," she said. I want you to know I regret everything." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Take care of yourself, Mom." And with that, I turned and walked away, feeling a strange sense of relief. The workshop turned into a lifeline. Week by week, I started piecing myself back together. My writing, though raw and unpolished, became an outlet for all the emotions I couldn't say out loud. One night, after I'd tucked Ethan into bed, I opened my laptop and started typing. This is the story of how I lost everything and found myself. The words flowed, each one a step toward healing. Months turned into a year. The pain of Mark and Linda's betrayal never fully disappeared, but it became manageable, a scar instead of an open wound. Ethan and I found a new rhythm, one that didn't include Mark's presence in our daily lives. And while the thought of dating again felt far off, I knew that one day, I'd be ready. For now, it was enough to know that I could survive. I could rebuild. I could thrive.